She saved his fiancée from a fire, but she ordered to send her to prison. Now she begged for forgiveness. Nobody expected the truth to come out like this. A woman ran into a burning house to save the life of a stranger, a woman she barely knew, but who was about to become her boss's wife. She didn't think twice. She just ran in. And for that one act of courage, she was handcuffed in front of the whole town, dragged away in the middle of the night while the fire still burned behind her. Years later, the same woman who pointed the finger at her would be on her knees, begging for forgiveness. But by then, everything had already been taken. Stay with me, this story is going to break your heart before it heals it. Hey everyone! Welcome back to the channel. Before we start, tell me in the comments, which country are you watching from today? I love seeing where you all are from. Today's story is about loyalty, betrayal, and the kind of forgiveness that most people wouldn't have the strength to give. It's emotional, it's heavy, and it has a twist I don't think you'll see coming. So stay till the end, because trust me, it's worth it. Some people never forget the sound of their own name being called out in fear. Josephine Bennett, everyone called her Josie, had worked at Cross Manor for almost 6 years. It was a big white house outside Charleston, South Carolina, the kind with tall columns out front and a garden that looked like something out of a magazine. Josie kept that house running. She knew which floorboard creaked in the hallway, which window stuck when it rained, and exactly how Mr. Cross liked his coffee. Black, no sugar, in the blue mug, never the white one. Nathaniel Cross was 34 years old and owned half the real estate in 3 states. He was the kind of rich that didn't need to show off, because everyone already knew who he was. But Josie never treated him like royalty. She treated him like a man who forgot to eat lunch most days and needed someone to remind him he was human. That year, Nathaniel had gotten engaged to a woman named Vanessa Hale. Vanessa was 32, beautiful in the way that made rooms go quiet when she walked in, and she came from old money of her own. She wasn't cruel to Josie, not exactly. But there was always a coldness there, a way Vanessa looked at her like she was furniture that happened to talk. Josie didn't mind. She had her own reasons for showing up every day and doing her job well. She had an 8-year-old daughter named Mia waiting for her at her mother's house across town, and every dollar she earned went toward making sure Mia never had to worry about anything the way Josie once had. The night of the engagement party, the whole estate was lit up gold. String lights wrapped around the porch, a live band played out on the lawn, and half of Charleston's wealthiest families had come to celebrate Nathaniel and Vanessa. Josie had been on her feet since 5 that morning, making sure every glass was polished and every flower arrangement was perfect. Around midnight, most of the guests had gone home. Josie was in the kitchen finishing the last of the dishes when she noticed something strange, a flicker of orange light reflecting off the window above the sink. At first she thought it was just the party light still on outside. Then she smelled smoke. She stepped out into the hallway and froze. Flames were already climbing the curtains near the east staircase, the one that led up to the guest wing where Vanessa had gone to lie down after the party wound down. The smoke was thick, curling along the ceiling like something alive. Josie didn't think about her own safety. She didn't think about the smoke filling her lungs or the heat pressing against her skin. She thought about the fact that someone was still up there, and no one else seemed to know. She ran toward the stairs, straight into the smoke, calling out a name she barely knew well enough to call a friend. Vanessa. Vanessa, where are you? What Josie didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known, was that the fire wasn't an accident. And by morning, the truth of how it started would tear her whole life apart. The heat inside that hallway felt like walking into an oven with the door still open. Josie covered her mouth with the collar of her shirt and pushed forward, her eyes burning, her vision blurring from the smoke. She found the guest room door already cracked open, and inside, Vanessa was on the floor near the bed, coughing, disoriented, one hand reaching weakly toward the window like she'd been trying to get up and couldn't. Vanessa, I've got you, stay with me, Josie said, pulling the woman's arm over her shoulder. Vanessa was barely conscious, mumbling something Josie couldn't make out over the roar of the fire now eating through the hallway wall. Josie half carried, half dragged her toward the back stairwell, the one usually used by staff, because the front stairs were already swallowed in flames. By the time they burst out through the kitchen door into the cool night air, both women collapsed onto the grass, coughing, gasping, alive. Firefighters were already pulling up the long driveway, red and blue lights washing over the front of the burning mansion. Nathaniel came sprinting from the guest house where he'd been staying that night, his face white with panic, and when he saw Vanessa breathing, sitting up, alive, he dropped to his knees beside her. "She saved me," Vanessa whispered, looking at Josie like she'd just watched a miracle happen. "She ran in and got me. I would have died in there." For a few hours, it felt like nothing else mattered. Nathaniel wrapped a blanket around both women's shoulders. Neighbors gathered at the end of the driveway, watching the flames finally get knocked down by the fire crews. Someone handed Josie a bottle of water. A paramedic checked her lungs and told her she was lucky, that the smoke could have done a lot more damage than it did. Josie sat on the back of an ambulance, hands shaking, and for the first time all night, allowed herself to cry. Not because she was scared. Because she'd almost lost her own life for a woman who barely looked at her most days, and in that moment, none of that seemed to matter anymore. She'd done the right thing. That was enough. But as the sun came up and the fire investigators started walking through the wreckage of the East Wing, something didn't sit right. One investigator crouched near the base of the guest room window, examining a scorch pattern that didn't match an electrical fire. Another found the remains of a candle, half melted into the windowsill, in a spot where no candle should have been burning that late at night. And in Vanessa's room, tucked behind an overturned nightstand, they found a man's cufflink. Not Nathaniel's. Vanessa saw the investigator holding it up to the light, turning it over in his gloved fingers, and something behind her eyes went cold and sharp, like a woman realizing the water was rising faster than she thought. She looked over at Josie, still sitting on the ambulance bumper, wrapped in a blanket, exhausted. And something ugly began to take shape in Vanessa's mind. A way out. A way to make sure nobody ever asked the question she couldn't afford to answer. Sometimes the people you save are the ones who turn on you the fastest. It took less than a day for the story to change. Vanessa sat with the fire investigator in the guest house, dabbing at eyes that weren't actually crying, and told him she remembered something she'd been too shaken to mention the night before. She said she'd smelled smoke and seen Josie standing near the doorway of her room holding something small and metallic, something that looked like a lighter, before running off. It was a lie. Every word of it. The truth was uglier than any fire. Vanessa hadn't been alone that night. Derek Monroe, the Cross family's financial advisor and an old flame from before Vanessa ever met Nathaniel, had come to see her after the party, sneaking in through the guest wing the way they always had for the past several months. A candle Vanessa lit to set the mood had been knocked over in their hurry to make sure no one saw him leaving. Derek had bolted out a side door in a panic once the smoke started, forgetting his cufflink on the nightstand in his rush. Vanessa knew exactly how the fire started. She knew exactly whose fault it was. But admitting that meant admitting to Nathaniel that she'd been unfaithful to him in his own house, days before their wedding, with a man he trusted with his family's entire financial future. It meant losing the ring, the mansion, the name, the life she had built for herself. And Vanessa Hale was not about to let a maid's heroics stand between her and everything she'd worked for. So she made a choice. A cruel, desperate, calculated choice. She told the investigator that Josie had access to the guest wing, that she'd seemed distant and resentful in recent weeks, that maybe she'd wanted to scare them or steal something valuable during the chaos. And when the investigators searched the staff quarters, with Vanessa's quiet suggestion pointing them exactly where to look, they found a diamond bracelet, one that had gone missing from Vanessa's jewelry box, tucked inside an old showbox under Josie's bed. Josie had never seen that bracelet in her life. She didn't know how it got there. But she would later learn that Vanessa had planted it herself, slipping into the staff quarters while everyone was still in shock from the fire, using a spare key she'd taken from the household office months earlier for exactly a moment like this. By that afternoon, 2 police officers were standing in the ash-covered front yard of Cross Manor, next to the half-collapsed porch, waiting for Josie to step outside. Nathaniel stood frozen beside Vanessa, his mind refusing to accept what he was hearing. Josie, the woman who ran into the fire, who had smoke damage in her lungs to prove it, accused of setting that very fire and stealing from the people she saved? It didn't make sense. And some small, quiet part of him knew it didn't make sense. But Vanessa's tears looked real. Her voice shook in all the right places. And grief has a way of making people believe the person standing closest to them, even when the truth is standing somewhere else entirely. Handcuffs feel a lot heavier than they look. Josie stood on what was left of the front lawn, the mansion still smoking behind her, ash falling like grey snow onto her shoulders. She hadn't slept. Her hands were still shaking from the smoke inhalation. And now a police officer was reading her rights while Nathaniel stood there in his white dress shirt, stained with soot from carrying Vanessa the night before, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't do this," Josie said, her voice cracking. "I saved her. Why would I?" We found the bracelet in your room," the officer said, not unkindly, just tired, just doing his job. "You have the right to remain silent." Vanessa stood a few feet away in her red dress, arms crossed, dried tears still streaked down her cheeks, watching the handcuffs click shut around Josie's wrists. For half a second, something flickered across her face, not guilt exactly, but the shadow of it, gone as quickly as it came. Josie looked at Nathaniel one last time before they walked her to the car. "You know me," she said quietly. 6 years, Mr. Cross. You know I would never." Nathaniel opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He wanted to believe her. Some part of him did believe her. But the evidence was sitting in an evidence bag, and his fiancée, the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 weeks, was standing there insisting Josie had done this. He was exhausted, in shock, grieving the house his grandfather built, and utterly unprepared to untangle the difference between the truth and a very convincing lie. He said nothing. And that silence would haunt him for years. Across town, Josie's mother received a phone call that made her sit straight down on the kitchen floor. Mia, 8 years old, was at the table doing homework, and she looked up when she heard her grandmother's voice crack. "Grandma. What happened? Where's Mommy?" Nobody had an answer that a child could understand. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that her mother ran into a burning building to save a stranger's life, and was arrested for it hours later? The trial moved fast, faster than it should have. Vanessa's family had connections, and connections in a town like that moved mountains quietly and quickly. The prosecutor painted Josie as a bitter employee who'd finally snapped, someone who resented the wealth around her and decided to take something for herself while pretending to be a hero. Josie's public defender was overworked and underprepared, and the physical evidence, the bracelet, the fabricated timeline, Vanessa's tearful testimony, was more than enough for a jury that didn't know any of them personally. 6 weeks later, Josephine Bennett was sentenced to 4 years in state prison for arson and grand theft. She didn't cry when the judge read the sentence. She'd already cried everything out weeks before. She just turned around one last time, searching the courtroom for her mother's face, for Mia, who hadn't been allowed to come. And in the back row, barely visible, she saw Nathaniel Cross sitting alone, his head down, unable to look up as they led her away. 4 years is a long time to wait for the truth to catch up to a lie. Josie's cell was small, grey, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. The first few months were the hardest. She missed Mia's laugh so much it felt physical, like a bruise she carried under her ribs. Every phone call was 10 minutes long and never enough. Every visit through the glass left her hands pressed flat against the barrier, aching to hold her daughter properly. Mia grew up fast during those years, the way kids do when the adults around them are trying too hard to protect them from something too big to hide. She started asking harder questions. Why did Mommy have to stay there? Why didn't the rich family help her? Why didn't anyone believe her? Josie's mother did her best, raising Mia on a part-time nurse's aide salary, keeping photos of Josie up around the house so Mia wouldn't forget her mother's face, driving 2 hours each way for visitation days that always ended too soon. Inside, Josie kept her head down and did her time the way she'd done everything else in her life. Quietly, with dignity, refusing to let bitterness eat away at whatever was left of her. She read every book the prison library had. She wrote Mia letters every single week, even the weeks she didn't get one back, because she needed her daughter to know she was still thinking of her every single day. She got a job in the prison kitchen, because cooking reminded her of home, of the woman she used to be before all of this happened. Meanwhile, life at Cross Manor moved forward, at least on the surface. The wedding was pushed back a year to rebuild the burned wing of the house, but eventually Nathaniel and Vanessa did marry, in a smaller, quieter ceremony than originally planned. Vanessa wore white. She smiled for photographs. And at night, she barely slept, haunted by a guilt she refused to name out loud, even to herself. Derek Monroe disappeared from Charleston not long after the fire, taking a job in another state, cutting off contact with Vanessa completely, terrified that any connection between them might unravel everything. But guilt doesn't stay buried just because the guilty person moves away. Nathaniel changed too, in ways his friends noticed but never mentioned. He grew quieter, more distant. He started spending long hours in his study, going over old security logs from the night of the fire, though he told himself it was just paperwork, just closure, nothing more. Deep down, a question kept surfacing that he couldn't put back down. Why had Josie, a woman who had never taken so much as an extra dollar in 6 years of managing his household budget, suddenly decided to steal a bracelet on the one night she'd risked her life to save someone? It didn't make sense. It had never made sense. And slowly, quietly, without telling anyone, Nathaniel began looking for the truth he was too afraid to face the night it happened. Guilt has a way of finding you, even years later, in the quietest moments. 3 years into Josie's sentence, Nathaniel hired a private investigator named Sarah Ruiz, a retired detective known for reopening cases everyone else had given up on. He told her it was about insurance discrepancies from the fire, too embarrassed to admit the real reason, that he couldn't stop thinking about the woman he'd let walk away in handcuffs without saying a single word in her defense. Detective Ruiz started quietly, pulling old phone records, re-interviewing the original fire investigators, and re-examining photographs from the night of the fire that had never made it into the official case file. One photo, taken by a young officer just for documentation purposes, showed the burn pattern near the guest room window in far more detail than the courtroom sketches had suggested. It wasn't consistent with someone entering from the hallway with a lighter. It was consistent with a candle, left burning on the windowsill, knocked over from someone standing near the bed. Ruiz also found something the original investigation had missed entirely, a receipt from a gas station 2 miles from the estate, time-stamped less than an hour before the fire started, for a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, paid for in cash by a man matching Derek Monroe's description on grainy security footage. Meanwhile, Vanessa's marriage to Nathaniel had grown cold in ways that had nothing to do with the fire, at least not on the surface. Late one evening, unable to carry the weight of it any longer, Derek called Vanessa from another state, drunk, desperate, and afraid. He told her he couldn't keep living like this, pretending an innocent woman wasn't sitting in prison because of a mistake they made together. She has a kid, Vanessa, he said, his voice breaking over the phone. She has a little girl waiting for her. I can't do this anymore. Vanessa hung up on him, shaking, and for the first time in 3 years, allowed herself to cry about something other than her own reputation. 2 nights later, Nathaniel found an old voicemail Derek had accidentally left on the house phone instead of Vanessa's cell, rambling and half-drunk, mentioning the fire, mentioning guilt, mentioning a name that made Nathaniel's blood run cold. Josie's name, spoken with the kind of desperation that only comes from someone telling the truth by accident. He played it twice. Then a third time. Then he sat in his study until sunrise, staring at nothing, finally understanding the shape of what he'd allowed to happen. Some truths don't announce themselves quietly. They arrive all at once, and they don't leave room to hide. Nathaniel brought the voicemail straight to Detective Ruiz the next morning. Combined with the gas station footage, the burn pattern photographs, and a fresh statement Ruiz managed to pull from Derek himself, who, exhausted from years of guilt, finally admitted everything over a shaky phone call from 3 states away, the picture became impossible to deny. Derek confirmed it all. The affair. The candle. The panic. The cufflink he'd left behind without realizing it. He hadn't known about the bracelet, hadn't known Vanessa planted evidence in Josie's room, hadn't known an innocent woman had spent 3 years in prison because of a night neither of them meant to end in flames. When Ruiz told him that part, Derek went silent on the phone for almost a full minute before he started to cry. Nathaniel confronted Vanessa that same evening, in the study where he'd spent so many recent nights piecing together the truth she'd hidden from him for years. He didn't yell. He didn't throw anything. He simply set the folder of evidence on the table between them and asked her one question. Did you know Josie didn't do this? Vanessa's silence answered before her words did. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a confession so much as a collapse. Years of guilt spilling out all at once, the affair, the candle, the panic, the bracelet she'd planted with her own hands while Josie was still coughing up smoke on the back of an ambulance. I didn't mean for it to go this far, Vanessa said, her voice shaking. I just needed time to think. I never thought they'd actually convict her. I thought it would just be questions, and then it would go away. She spent 3 years in prison, Nathaniel said quietly. She has a daughter who grew up without her. And you let it happen because you didn't want to admit you'd been unfaithful in my own house. There was nothing Vanessa could say to make that smaller than it was. Within a week, Nathaniel had hired the best appeals attorney in the state, handed over every piece of evidence Ruiz had gathered, and personally sat down with the district attorney's office to explain, in detail, exactly how badly the original investigation had failed an innocent woman. The truth doesn't undo the years it took to find it, but it can still change everything that comes after. The appeal moved faster than anyone expected, largely because Nathaniel Cross's name carried weight, and because the evidence, once properly examined, left no real room for doubt. Derek gave a formal statement confirming the affair and the true cause of the fire. Forensic experts re-examined the burn patterns and confirmed what the original investigation had missed. And an anonymous tip, later revealed to be Nathaniel himself, led investigators to a security guard who remembered seeing Vanessa near the staff quarters early that morning after the fire, holding something small in her hand, though he'd never thought to mention it at the time. Vanessa was formally charged with evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. Whatever remained of her marriage to Nathaniel ended quietly, without drama, without a public scene, just 2 people signing papers in a lawyer's office, both of them changed by everything the last few years had cost. On the day of Josie's release hearing, the courtroom looked nothing like it had 4 years earlier. This time, Nathaniel sat in the front row, not the back. Detective Ruiz sat beside him. And when the judge read the order overturning Josie's conviction, declaring her innocent of every charge, the room went completely silent for a moment before someone in the back, Josie's mother, let out a sob of relief so loud it broke the silence wide open. Josie stood there in a plain grey prison uniform for the last time, tears running freely down her face, unable to fully process the word she'd waited 3 years to hear. Innocent. Free. Home. Outside the courthouse, Mia, now 11 years old, taller, changed in the way children change when they grow up too fast, ran across the parking lot the moment she saw her mother walk through the doors. Josie dropped to her knees right there on the pavement and wrapped her arms around her daughter so tightly neither of them could speak for a long moment, just holding on, making up for 3 years of hugs that never happened. Forgiveness is never owed to anyone. It has to be asked for, humbly, without excuses. 2 months after her release, Josie was settling back into life slowly. New apartment, new job managing a small bakery downtown that Nathaniel had quietly helped her get on her feet, evenings spent catching up on everything she'd missed with Mia. She wasn't the same woman who'd walked into that courtroom 4 years earlier. She was steadier now, in a way that only comes from surviving something that should have broken her. One afternoon, there was a knock at her apartment door. When Josie opened it, Vanessa was standing there, thinner than Josie remembered, dressed plainly, none of the polish or confidence she used to carry like armor. Her eyes were red-rimmed, like she'd been crying in the car before working up the courage to knock. "I know I have no right to be here," Vanessa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know sorry isn't enough for what I took from you. 3 years, Josie. Your daughter's childhood. Your name. I let all of it happen because I was too much of a coward to tell the truth." Josie stood in the doorway for a long moment, saying nothing, feeling the old anger rise up in her chest, hot and justified. She had every right to close the door. Every right to tell this woman to leave and never come back. But she thought about the years she'd spent in a small grey cell, choosing every single day not to let bitterness win, not to let what was done to her turn her into someone cruel in return. She thought about Mia, and the kind of mother she wanted to be. One who showed her daughter that strength wasn't the same thing as hardness. "You destroyed years of my life," Josie finally said. "I'm not going to pretend that's okay. I'm not going to pretend I've forgotten what you did." Vanessa nodded, tears falling freely now, ready to turn and walk away. "But I'm not going to carry the weight of hating you for the rest of my life either," Josie continued. "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it. Because I do." Some stories don't end with everything fixed. They end with everything finally honest. Vanessa didn't expect forgiveness that day, and she didn't expect it to erase what she'd done, either. The legal consequences of her actions followed her regardless, a criminal record of her own, a reputation in Charleston that would never fully recover, a quiet exit from the social circles she'd spent her whole life climbing into. But something in her did change after that conversation on Josie's doorstep. She spent the following months, quietly and without cameras or publicity, volunteering with a legal aid organization that helped wrongfully convicted people rebuild their lives after release, the closest thing she could offer to making something right out of something she broke. Nathaniel, for his part, stayed close to Josie's life in the months that followed, not out of guilt exactly, but out of a genuine desire to help repair what his silence in that courtroom had helped cost her. He fully funded Mia's education, set up a trust that would carry her through college, and helped Josie expand her small bakery into a second location the following spring. Not as charity, he told her, but as long overdue back pay for 6 years of loyalty he should have honored the moment it mattered most. Josie never forgot what those 4 years took from her. But she also never let them define the rest of her life. She watched Mia grow into a confident, kind young woman who understood, better than most kids her age, what real strength looked like, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that keeps showing up, keeps being good, even when the world hasn't been good back. If this story taught us anything, it's that the truth doesn't always come out on time, but it usually comes out. And when it does, the people who did right, even when no one was watching, are the ones left standing tallest. Josie ran into a burning house for a woman who barely knew her name, and she paid a devastating price for it. But in the end, her honesty, her patience, and her refusal to become bitter are what carried her through to the other side. If this story moved you, take a second to hit like. It really helps this channel keep telling stories like Josie's. Subscribe if you want more real, emotional stories like this one every week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that doing the right thing is always worth it, even when it costs you everything for a while, share this with them. Thank you for watching till the end. I'll see you in the next one.